Okay. Yeah, so that picture this week, that's what Lyotard was like. The last picture was Kuhn, before that the picture was Russell. So we're starting Lyotard. The background work of art, you would raise your hand, please, if you recognize the painting that is in the background of this. Art, yeah, you're right. What's that? It's Marilyn Monroe. That's right. The actor is Marilyn Monroe. But the reason it's up there is this is from a famous series of paintings by American artist Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol was a postmodern artist. And so, look at this. That's right. Andy Warhol is a famous American artist. He was born in Pittsburgh, which is a large city near where I was born. And he's actually Polish descent. My mother's parents are from Poland. Van Norden is a Dutch name, but on my mother's side, and Andy Warhol is also, his ancestors were from Poland. And he's a very interesting artist, and one of the things he did was to take things like Marilyn Monroe, who was a movie star, and he did this painting where he had 4 images of her in different colors. And it's just, like he said, art. And so it was very unusual art. So he's a postmodern artist. And so that's why I use that as a background. So I'm going to go through the book in order, although I will sometimes quote passages from later in the book to explain earlier passages. So first, we're going to explain the introduction. If you carefully read the introduction to the postmodern condition, all the major themes of the book are in the introduction. However, the introduction is very hard to understand without understanding the rest of the book. So once you've read the rest of the book, you'll recognize, all the major themes are already in the introduction. They're all there. So what is the postmodern condition? Lyotard says, I will use the term modern to designate any science that legitimates itself. I will use the term modern to designate any science that legitimates itself with reference to a meta-discourse of this kind, making an explicit appeal to some grand narrative. And then he says, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. Now, I think many of you recognize Lyotard is much harder to read than Russell or Kuhn. I think you felt that. In English, it seems like, if you're a native speaker of English, it seems like Lyotard is much harder to understand than Russell or Kuhn. I'm not saying that Russell and Kuhn were easy. I'm just saying that even if Inyu should a muyu, we still think that Lyotard was hard to understand. Lyotard is writing in what is sometimes called the philosophy in the West today is sometimes divided into analytic philosophy, 分析哲学, and continental philosophy. And some major analytic figures include Frege, Russell, whom we've read. Russell is one of the major figures in analytic philosophy. Russell's good friend, Moore, Carnap, who's a German philosopher, but one who was very influential in analytic philosophy, Quine. You have a reading from Quine on the QQ group, but we won't have time to get to it. And Davidson, whom I hope we will have time to read after Lyotard. On the continental side, you've got Husserl, Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida, and of course, Lyotard. Now, personally, I like philosophers who are continental, and I also like philosophers who are analytic. And I also like Chinese philosophy. This makes me really unusual in the West. Very unusual to find someone who likes analytic continental philosophy and Chinese philosophy. Very unusual. But if something is philosophically interesting, I think it's interesting. But there are stylistic differences. In the case of Lyotard and many later continental thinkers, I don't know Husserl as well, so I'm not taking a stance on Husserl. I don't understand. I just haven't read it as much, so I don't know. But Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, sometimes it seems to me that their vocabulary is unnecessarily complex. They don't need to have a vocabulary that is this complex. And their sentence structure is more complicated than it needs to be. So it makes it harder to understand. So I think that's a problem with some thinkers like Derrida and Foucault, and sometimes Heidegger, depends. Being in time, Heidegger's major work, I think, actually pretty good. But Heidegger's later work is really hard to understand. But if you ask people like Lyotard, why do you write in such a way that is hard to understand, I think Lyotard would say two things. Lyotard would say, people like Russell and Kuhn and these other guys, they're hard to understand too. They're just hard in a different way. So that's one thing they'll say. They'll say, well, you can't tell me that everything in Russell is easy. That's not, Russell's hard just in a different way. And the article by Quine, I gave you two articles by Quine on the QQ group. Again, we don't have time to discuss them in the course. They're really hard. If you read them and want to talk about them, I will, but they're really hard. So one thing Lyotard or Derrida or probably Heidegger would say is, well, yes, we're hard to read, but so are analytic philosophers just in a different way. The other thing they'll say, I think, is we're going to see that Lyotard emphasizes creativity and coming up with new language games. So Lyotard, I think, would say, you can't tell me, I can't say I want to invent new language games and then talk like everybody else. If I'm going to invent new ways of talking, I have to invent new ways of talking. I have to be complicated. Why? I'm trying to not sound like other people. I don't know if I agree that he has to do that. He could be creative, I think, and be more clear. That's my opinion, but I think that's what he would say. So these are hard sentences in English, even if you're a native speaker of English. But what do they mean? He says, well, he's contrasting what it is to be a modernist or to be modern versus being postmodern. And he says, well, modernists are people who legitimate what they're talking about in terms of a meta-discourse. whereas postmodernists are incredulous towards metanarratives. Now, one thing to notice here is sometimes Lyotard will use terms that are synonymous. They mean the same things, but he'll use different terms for them. So, for Lyotard, narrative, discourse, first-level theory, they mean about the same thing. And when he says metanarrative, or meta-discourse, or higher-level theory, those all mean about the same thing. Now, Russell occasionally does this. If you read Problems of Philosophy, Russell sometimes says instinctive, sometimes says self-evident, and sometimes says, what's the other synonym he uses? Intuitive, instinctive, self-evident. But usually, once Russell picks a term, he sticks with that term. But in the case of Lyotard, it's more common to switch between terms. Now, what's a narrative? A narrative it's really like a theory. It's a theory about the world in some sense. So, physics is an example of a narrative. Ethics is an example of a narrative. They're theories about some aspect of the world. And then a meta-narrative is a higher level theory about why a first level theory is justified. So a narrative could be something like physics, and then a meta-narrative would be a story about why that narrative or theory is justified. Or a meta-discourse. This meta-narrative is a theory about why another theory is justified, why you should believe another theory. And incredulity simply means disbelief. So we can paraphrase. I'm going to be doing a lot of paraphrasing when we talk about Lyotard. Lyotard says, I will use the term modern to designate any science that legitimates itself with reference to a meta-discourse. That means modernism is belief in a higher level theory that justifies a first-order theory. Later in the lecture, I'll give you specific examples. But a modernist is somebody who says, I've got a theory about the world, and I've got this higher level theory that tells you why you should believe the lower level theory. Then when Lyotard says, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives, that means postmodernism is disbelief in any higher level theory that would justify a first-order theory. So in other words, the postmodern condition is a condition in which you're just unwilling to believe any theory anybody could give you about why you should believe the truth of a lower level theory. You're just disbelieving any higher level theory. Let's look at an example of what modernism would be like so you can understand this more clearly. An example of a narrative or a theory might be contemporary science or any part of contemporary science. So it could be physics, chemistry, biology, etc. So that's an example of a narrative. Contemporary physics is a narrative. Contemporary biology is a narrative. Basically a theory. Now, a meta-narrative would be something like what we talked about in previous classes, the covering law model of science. You remember that? That's the one where I drew all those bricks on the board, and I said the lower level bricks are things like this bird, this chicken lays an egg, this chicken lays an egg, this chicken lays an egg, and then the higher level brick is something like all chickens lay eggs. And then it's like this duck lays eggs, this duck lays eggs, this duck lays eggs, all ducks lay eggs. And then you have a third level thing where you say all birds lay eggs. So in the covering law model of science, science is a cumulative process in which we know more and more about the universe. So first we know that all chickens lay eggs, and then we know that all ducks lay eggs, and then we know that all birds lay eggs. Those are really simple examples, but you get it. And the foundation of science is direct and purely objective observation of the world. Later observations just add to earlier observations. Finally, later scientific theories include earlier theories as parts. This is the covering law model of science. So, if you accepted the covering law model of science, which says, well, science is this cumulative process where it's just based on what you directly observe, and the theories explain the observations, and the observations always stay the same, and the theory just covers more and more of the observations. That story, that narrative, that theory, would explain why you should believe physics. You ask, why should I believe physics? The answer would be, well, it's based on direct observation, and the observations are fixed. Once we made an observation, we know it's true. And all the theory does is the theory gets bigger and bigger and includes more and more observations. So why wouldn't you believe it? That's terrific. So this is an example of a modernist view. So one way, I just thought of this while I was doing this lecture. I thought, oh, I should have done this earlier when I was explaining what Kuhn was rejecting. This is the covering law metanarrative of scientific progress. It's a picture of what you might think it's like. So, and I'm gonna put this PowerPoint up on the QQ group. So you're welcome to take pictures of the slides too, but I'm also gonna upload it to the QQ group. So, on the covering law model, Copernicus made some observations, and he had some theories. And then Galileo comes along, he keeps all the same observations, but he comes up with a theory that explains even more than Copernicus did, but it keeps everything Copernicus knew. And then Newton comes along, keeps everything Galileo observed, keeps every part of Galileo's theory, but then explains even more than Galileo or Copernicus did. Then Einstein comes along, and Newton's theory is just a part of Einstein's theory. Keeps all the same observations, keeps all the same theory. Einstein just includes more of all the same observations and the same theories that were so wonderful before. This is probably the way, if you were taught the history of science, this is the way it's taught in most textbooks. This is the standard. The second quick example of modernism, Russell's view is a modernist view. Russell gives us a modernist metanarrative. Russell says, and you've seen this quotation before, what we firmly believe, if it is true, called knowledge, provided it is either intuitive or inferred from intuitive knowledge from which it follows logically. And that's in chapter 5 of the Problems of Philosophy. So in other words, if you ask Russell, why should I believe the truths of science or the truths you're trying to convince me of, he's going to say, well, all the truths I'm trying to convince you of are either intuitive, that means no rational person could doubt them. You just look and you see what color something is, right? Or you just look and you see what shape something is. Or you just listen and you know what something sounds like. Or knowledge is inferred logically from things that you directly intuit, and the rules of logic, Russell tells us, those are also self-evident. No rational person could doubt those either. This is what Lyotard is talking about, not Russell in particular, but this approach in general when he says, Lyotard says, for example, the rule of consensus between the sender and the addressee of a statement with truth value is acceptable if it is cast in terms of a possible unanimity between rational minds. This is the Enlightenment narrative. Again, methodological disagreement, I tend to write like an analytic philosopher, but I admire many continental philosophers. If a student, none of you write like this, but when I'm teaching English in the United States, English composition, I sometimes get students who write like this. And if a student wrote like this, I would say, you are smart and have a lot of good ideas, but you have to express it more clearly. How are you going to convince people if you don't write more clearly? And so I think this sentence could be written much more simply. But the idea is really interesting. What's the idea? Well, when he says, sender and addressee. The sender is the person who either says something or writes the book or gives you a message of some kind. Addressee, that's the person who gets the message. It's your audience. It could be one person if I'm talking just to you. It could be thousands of people if I'm posting it on the web or if I wrote a textbook. And truth value is a technical term it's actually in analytic philosophy, it's a technical term. There are only two truth values, true and false. So when you say a statement with truth value, what you mean is a statement that could be true or could be false. Now, you might say, well, isn't that every statement? No. If I say, open the door, that's not true and it's not false. It's a command. It is true that the door is closed, but the command to open the door is not true or false. So, Lyotard is saying, I'm talking about statements that have a truth value that could be true or false. Right? What about them? Well, they're deemed acceptable if there could be a consensus, that means agreement, or unanimity, that means agreement of everybody, every sender, every addressee, between rational minds. So what does that mean? It means a statement with truth value is deemed acceptable. In other words, it's deemed true if it's possible for rational minds to all agree that it's true. That's what Russell's looking for with his notion of intuitive knowledge. Russell says all knowledge is either based in something intuitive, where anybody who's not crazy can see what we're talking about. It's either an observation that any rational person can see, or it's a logical truth that any rational person can see, or it's logically deduced in a way that any rational person can see. So this is a really roundabout way of saying that the Enlightenment narrative, the Enlightenment is a period in history in the West, and it's a period in history that begins, well, we can argue about when the Enlightenment begins. Different historians will take different dates, but if we're talking about Enlightenment philosophers, that will include people like Descartes, Bacon, most important. And Russell and modernism are the eventual results of the Enlightenment. So, Lyotard is saying an example of an Enlightenment or a modernist metanarrative is the view that, well, a statement's deemed to be true if all rational minds would agree to it. Okay, so we know what modernism is supposed to be. Why should we have incredulity toward metanarratives? Why should we doubt metanarratives? What's the matter with metanarratives? What's the matter with the covering law model or Russell's theory? Well, we spent most of the course talking about why you might have doubts about the covering law model or Russell's view. Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions undermines every aspect of Russell's modernist metanarrative. Kuhn also undermines the covering law model of scientific progress. So one way of thinking about it is, Russell is saying, look, any rational person would observe certain things and would draw certain conclusions. Kuhn tries to give us examples from the history of science where rational people have seen different things and rational people have drawn different conclusions. So let's review. Here's a model or kind of a visual representation of the current law metanarrative of scientific progress. So this is a modernist metanarrative. The idea is, well, of course you should believe science because it's this cumulative process where you get more and more and more and more truth. And the earlier truths are just part of the later truth. But then what's Kuhn's alternative view? You have to represent Kuhn's view of the development of science, it would look more like this. What does that mean? Well, Copernicus comes along and he observes certain things, and he also has certain aspects of his theory to explain those observations. Galileo comes along. Galileo keeps some of the observations that Copernicus kept, and some of the theory that Copernicus kept. But Galileo also has observations that are completely different from Copernicus. And some of Copernicus's observations would be rejected by Galileo. And some aspects of Copernicus's theory would be rejected by Galileo. So Galileo and Copernicus only overlap here. Now you might say, well, that's not too bad. At least they only overlap here. But then when Newton comes along, same problem. Newton will agree with Galileo in this region, where the Galileo circle and the Newton circle come together. So they'll share certain parts of theory in here and certain observations in here. But then Newton actually might share some things with Copernicus that Galileo dropped, and some observations that Galileo thought he made will be dropped by Newton. For example, Kuhn mentions in passing that one of Galileo's major contributions to science, and this is something you study in every intro-level physics class, is about the period of a pendulum. So if you have a pendulum, so you have a fixed point here, you have a string or some kind of wire, and then you have a weight here, and you lift it up this far, and then you see how long it takes it to go from here. And you can, how long it takes it to go from here, right, to back again, like what's the period of the pendulum. And Galileo has a famous formula about how the period of the pendulum, how long it takes it to go from here to here, depends on the length of the pendulum, but doesn't depend on what the measurement is of this angle. So Galileo asserts that that's only true up to about 20 degrees. After 20 degrees, it's false. So that's an observation that Galileo claims to have made, but it's false. So when Newton comes along, he says, no, that observation is false. That part of the theory is also wrong. Just tosses it out. So it's not a cumulative process. Then Einstein comes along, right, so he went here to here to here to here, and Einstein shares some things with Newton, some things with Copernicus, some things with Galileo, but some new things. And then there are also things that were part of Newton's view that just aren't part of Einstein's view. The notion that space and time are absolute was part of Newton's view. It's not part of Einstein's view. It's not preserved as part of Einstein's view. The notion that mass and energy are conserved independently of each other. That's central to Newton's view. No role in Einstein, where mass energy as one thing is preserved. So, could be wrong, but this is Kuhn's view. So, if Kuhn's right, the meta-narrative that tells you why you should believe in science has been undermined. And so if you ask, well, why should I believe Einstein? Kuhn's going to say, well, in terms of science telling you what actually exists, you don't have a reason to believe Einstein. Einstein just is better at solving certain kinds of puzzles than you are. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but this is just kind of interesting. One point that's interesting to notice is, as Kuhn explains in the preface to his work, The Essential Tension, I had to read part of that, he was a physicist. He almost completed his degree in physics when he was asked to teach a course in the history of physics. And fortunately for us, he was one of those really determined people who just keeps reading and reading and reading, And he tried to teach earlier physics and earlier astronomy, and he said, I don't get it. It just seems so stupid. But he said, but how could people like Aristotle be stupid about physics when he was smart about so many other things? And also, if Aristotle's stupid, why did so many smart people believe him for a couple thousand years? So I kept reading it over, and you could say the same thing. I mean, I say this, there are some people who will like glance at, the Analects. We call it the Lunyu. In English, we call the Lunyu, we call the Analects. Analects is a really weird English word. It's not a common. Pretty much only use the word Analects as a translation of Lunyu. That actually is an English proper noun, but it's only used in English as a translation of Lunyu. So, but there are people who read the Lunyu and they'll just say, it seems dumb to me. And I'll say, so you're telling me the smartest people in Chinese history for 2,500 years thought this was a really great book, and it's dumb? Really? You think everybody in China was dumb for 2,500 years? Well, at least they knew how to observe a supernova, huh? I'm trying to laugh at that. Get it? Because remember, in China, people always saw supernovas. In Europe, people never saw supernovas. So I tell people, look, you have to use Kuhn's same strategy, which is, it can't be that Aristotle's just dumb or smart people would not have believed it. It can't be that Confucius, if you read him and you say, it looks dumb to me. Brilliant people did not believe Confucius for 2,000 years because he was stupid. There was something valuable there, and if you don't understand yet, keep trying to understand. So Kuhn, that's what he did, and he tried to objectively and, in a sense, scientifically understand the history of science. But in trying to objectively and scientifically understand the history of science, what happened to Kuhn was he undermined the standard understanding that scientists have of what they do. And Nietzsche talks about this, and Lyotard talks about this, not specifically about Kuhn, but, I'm going to quote just the part that's in italics here. Nietzsche shows that European nihilism resulted from the truth requirement of science being turned back against itself. What we have here is a process of delegitimation fueled by the demand for legitimation itself. So, what is European nihilism? It's a phrase from Nietzsche. And part of what Nietzsche means by European nihilism is something very close to postmodernism. And Nietzsche says what leads to European nihilism is people using the search for truth really carefully on the search for truth. So you search for truth in trying to look at how we search for truth. But when you do, you discover all these problems. And so science ends up undermining itself. So we have a process of delegitimation. In other words, a process in which something that was regarded as legitimate is regarded as de-legitimized. And what's it fueled by? What's the motive thing that makes it like gasoline go? It's the demand for legitimation itself. It's because you're like, give me a proof. You're like, okay, here's my effort to prove something. Well, prove that. Here's my effort to prove that. Prove that. Here's my effort to prove that. And you keep doing it until it undermines science itself. So this is not the most important slide, but I just think it's interesting that Lyotard mentions this point from Nietzsche about how part of the cause for postmodernism is the effort of science to keep searching for the truth, and ironically that applies to Kuhn, who was himself a scientist, who tried to use science to study science, and thereby undermine a standard view of assignment. So one reason you might be incredulous towards metanarratives is you might have read Kuhn. And you might say, well, some metanarratives, like the covering law model or Russell's view, Kuhn raises a lot of problems for them. But that's not the primary reason that Lyotard questions metanarratives. Lyotard, although in the footnotes, or the endnotes, Lyotard does actually mention Kuhn as a source of some of his ideas. But for Lyotard, he emphasizes the notion of language games, which he talked a little bit about last time. So Lyotard says there are many different language games, a heterogeneity of elements. They only give rise to institutions in patches, local determinism. So there are many different language games. A heterogeneity of elements. Heterogeneity means they're of different kinds. Right? Just like there are different kinds of games like 国际象棋 and 中国象棋 and soccer, or football, which is what they call soccer in some parts of Europe, but in the U.S. they call football something different. So there's American football and European football, which is really what Americans call soccer. These are all different games. Their games are heterogeneous. There's a heterogeneity of games. There's different kinds of games in general. So likewise, there are many different kinds of language games. They're not of one kind. And because there's so many of them, they only give rise to institutions and patches, local determinism. That means if you ask for example, if you ask, can I touch the ball with my hands? Can I touch the ball with my hands? There is a determinate answer to that, but only if you know what game you're playing. If you're playing soccer, is soccer in Chinese zuqiu? Okay. So if you're playing, and Americans don't really play a lot of soccer. Usually you play when you're a kid, and then you go to watch your kids' soccer games because, it's really good for your heart. And also, you don't hit each other like in American football, so it's safe. So we usually encourage our kids to play soccer. But then when you get older, nobody watches it on TV. So in other words, I might be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding, based on watching my son and daughter play soccer, is when you play zuqiu, you can't touch the ball with your hands unless you're the goalie. So if you ask, can I touch the ball? The answer is, depends on the game. If you're playing soccer, no, you can't, unless you're the goalie. The answer is determined. There's determinism in the answer. It's determined. It's fixed. But only in the game. What about if I'm playing basketball? Yes, but you can't palm the ball in basketball. You can't do this in basketball. And you can't, there's like a 3-step rule. See, I'm really not a sports guy. There's like a rule, I think you can take 1-2 steps with the ball, but then you have to toss it. I think, you're not, okay, thank you. So can I hold the ball for 2 steps? Yes, you can. Right? What about football? Oh, you can run with the ball. American rule football, oh yeah, run with the ball all you want. You can keep running. Can you throw the ball? Yes, you can. In baseball, you can throw the ball all you want. It may not be a good idea, but you can always throw the ball in baseball. If you're on defense. But in football, you can't always, in American football, you can't always throw the ball. Sometimes the quarterback can't throw the ball. If he throws it, it's a foul. He wasn't in a position to throw it. He had no legal receiver downfield. See, that's the most sports I know. So the answer to can you touch the ball, can you throw the ball, can I use my hands, depends on the game. So likewise, the idea is there's determinate answers to what you can do in a language game, but only in a particular game. If you ask outside of the game, there's no answer. So think back to Kuhn for a second. I hope the pieces are starting to fall into place, right? What was one of the major objections to Copernicus's view? There are biblical passages in the Bible that strongly suggest, two in particular, one that strongly suggests that the earth does not move, and one that strongly suggests that the sun does move. And not just Catholics, but also Protestants in the West. Really? Okay. I thought I was going faster than that. But objected to Copernicus's view on the grounds that it was inconsistent with the Bible. Why? Because in the astronomy language game of Copernicus's era, it was a legitimate move to make to say, that can't be true, it contradicts the Bible. If you tried to do it in modern science, they'd say, that's not a legitimate move. You can't make that move. It's not a move in our language game. Okay, we'll take a quick break, then we'll continue with this. I'm going to show you shot.
哎，你叫梁慧玲啊？我以为是个女生，我以为是真的。
要对对。
没说呀。交了吗？那下一次。
Please give me your papers for this week. Pile them up here, and I'll take it and I'll grade up with you the last one.
谁上面的？然后它写回归，大概是下面这个是，我想它的角度都可以吧？对，这样的可以两个一样。应该是这样的吧？对，两种都可以。你是用哪个来讲？可以的，他在那里上面我以为那天晚上很晚才给我发过来那个文章，他是我的偶像。谁是你偶像啊？潘慧玲是榜样。要看你参考你的作业是吧？看了没？我说他是啊，我们也都想看看。哦，你放到邮箱里了是吧？我也想看看。我问你个问题啊，待会儿你。哦，好。你是不是问老师问题了？每个礼拜一下午。
我这次从他那儿转一下啊，谢谢。学习一下。
那你这样，我想问你个问题啊。都送了。
中间的意思传上来，细节看。
现在有点初中的样子了，好像是吧？
So here's I wrote an example up on the board that's kind of generally based on some things from Kuhn, just to help illustrate what Lyotard's talking about. So in the astronomy language game, so this is not how Kuhn phrases it, but this is how Lyotard would phrase it. In the astronomy language game that Copernicus plays, if we say, well, look, we know the sun moves because the Bible says so, it's in the Bible, that's a legitimate move in Copernicus's language game. If you tried to say that in contemporary astronomy, people would look at you like you were crazy, right? Even a Christian astronomer would say, that's not how you do astronomy. Right? There are Christian astronomers who just say, well, that's silly, you don't do astronomy like that. That's not how it works. On the other hand, if you said, well, with the same physics applies to the moon as applies to the earth, that's a legitimate move in a language game in contemporary astronomy. In fact, it's so legitimate, it's just obvious. It's not a legitimate move in Copernicus's language game. Because at the time of Copernicus, people took it for granted. They took it as an assumption. They took it as obvious that the moon and the stars and the planets and the sun were somehow fundamentally different from things on Earth. Which isn't a silly thing to think, because after all, the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets seem to move with remarkable regularity, unchanging, whereas everything on Earth is changing all the time. And so the planets and the stars, they seem to move the same way again and again and again, and as far as we know, forever. Whereas it's raining now, maybe it'll rain again tomorrow, didn't rain yesterday, it's cold now, sometimes it's really cold this time in October, sometimes it's not. So in Copernicus' era, if you said, well, look, of course the physics of the moon is the same as the physics of the Earth, they'd say, no, that's not, what are you talking about? Doesn't make any sense. But if you said it now, they'd say, well, yeah, of course. The physics on the moon is exactly the same as the physics on Earth. They're just one set of physics. Physics means something different in Copernicus' era. Physics is about things in the world, not things on the moon and beyond. That's astronomy, it's different people. So those are just two examples where you have two statements, one of which is legitimate for Copernicus. Copernicus is legitimate in the sense that Copernicus obviously does not think this is a decisive objection, but he recognizes it's a legitimate argument to give. Contemporary astronomy would say not even close to a legitimate argument. On the other hand, same physics applies to the Earth, absolutely legitimate in contemporary physics, not legitimate at all in Copernicus' physics. So there's local determinism. If you ask, well, what's the right move, or what moves can you make, depends on the language game you're playing. And the notion of a language game comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, which was published in 1953 after Wittgenstein died. Wittgenstein's the only philosopher I know who has published more since he died than he did during life. He only published one actual book in his life. And so, but he wrote a bunch of things, but after he died, his students and his admirers and his colleagues published a bunch of his works. The Philosophical Investigations was very close to being published when he died. I think he died in 52. And in this work, in the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein rejected the modernist view he had espoused, he had defended, he had enunciated, he had spoken espoused means like defended something or saying something you agree with. He had espoused in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which was published really first in 1921 in a journal, and then in 1922 as a separate book. So in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Wittgenstein has a modernist view very close to Russell's view. And again, I've said this before, Russell and Wittgenstein, very close. I don't know if I told you this anecdote, this funny story, but Wittgenstein was a very depressed person, like clinically, psychologically depressed. It's something I shouldn't joke about, because that's it's kind of sad, because two of Wittgenstein's brothers committed suicide. Yeah, so he had this serious depression running in his family. But the little slightly lighter side, sometimes he would, when he and Russell were very close friends back in this period, sometimes he would visit Russell, and they would talk philosophy. But other times, Wittgenstein would just pace. And so imagine you're in Bertrand Russell's den, or his shoebox, or his study, and Russell's just sitting there helplessly staring at Wittgenstein. Paces back and forth, sometimes for an hour or more. And so one evening, Russell said, "Are you thinking about formal logic or about your sins?" Because he knew that Wittgenstein was a very devout Christian, and he was worried that Wittgenstein was concerned about whether he was sinful or not. And so Russell said, "Are you thinking about logic or about your sins?" And Wittgenstein said, "Both." So Wittgenstein was a very interesting character. And as I say, when later in his career, as Wittgenstein moved away from this view, Russell never forgave him. But Wittgenstein apparently always respected his teacher to the end of his career. And if Wittgenstein's students ever said anything dismissive about Russell, then Wittgenstein would say, no, Russell's a great man. We don't make fun of Russell. So what are some examples of different language games? I gave this example last time, but I added some things, so let's just quickly review. There's a descriptive language game. The door is closed. It's a statement that has truth value. Right? It's either true or false. There are imperatives. Close the door. It's not true, it's not false. It's a command. There are prescriptives. The door ought to be closed. There are interrogatives, questions. Is the door closed? There are exclamatory things. The door! There are performatives. I promise to close the door. There is a whole area in the philosophy of language that grew out of Wittgenstein's discussion of these different uses of language. There are books and articles about these different uses of language. Because philosophers reading Wittgenstein said, well, that's a really good point. We haven't talked about all these other interesting uses of language and how different they are. Like performances. Like, I promise to close the door. Now, at one level you say, well, that's either true or false. Either I promised or I didn't. But notice when I say it, I promise to close the door, I've also done something. I promised. So the statement is itself an action. It's the performance of an action of promising. Or the other classic example, in wedding ceremonies in the West, it's very common for the minister or the judge, if it's a civil ceremony, to say, I pronounce you man and wife. So what makes you man and wife? The minister or the priest or the rabbi or the judge says, I pronounce you man and wife. So what makes it happen? You just did it right there. But promising is an especially good example. It's like the promise, it is true or false. Either I promised or I didn't, but it's also an action. It's the promising. And then there's a lot of discussion of, well, how are prescriptives and imperatives related? Is every prescriptive, the door ought to be closed, is it actually a concealed imperative? So some people said, well, this is the trick to understanding prescriptives, is they're actually hidden imperatives. So they're not really different language games. But they said we'll only see that because Wittgenstein made us think about how they were related. So when you say the door ought to be closed, you mean somebody close the door. One of you close the door ought to be closed. I don't think that's the correct analysis, but it's interesting. So I'm just saying, huge areas, if Wittgenstein had done nothing else besides say, here are some different ways we use language, his influence would have been huge in Western philosophy. But this just spun off this whole area in philosophy. Lyotard often discusses three games in particular. These are quotations from later in the book. The denotative game, denotative is not a common English word, in which what is relevant is the true-false distinction. The prescriptive game, in which the just-unjust distinction pertains. The technical game, in which the criterion is the efficient-inefficient distinction. Lyotard mentions some other games as well, but these are the three that he mentions most often. So he says, sometimes we're playing the denotative game, in which we're looking for statements that are either true or false. Really, we want ones that are true, but true-false, those are the relevant factors. Sometimes we're playing the prescriptive game, and he says, what we're really concerned with is what is just, or what is fair, and what is unjust, what is unfair. I think that's a narrow view of the prescriptive game, because you could have other prescriptive ideas besides just and unjust. You could have courageous and cowardly. You could have kind and cruel. But Lyotard is particularly interested in just and unjust in connection with the prescriptive game. And then there's the technical game, in which the criterion is the efficient-inefficient distinction. And in the technical game, you're just asking, how can I produce the most given the input I've got? So given that I have this amount of input into the system, how can I get the maximum output out of it? What's the best way to get the most out of it, given what I'm putting into it? Now, these types can be subdivided. So if we talk about the denotative games, one aspect of denotative games is natural scientific language games. So there's the Aristotelian natural scientific language game. And you know where it's going to go from here. Copernican, Galilean, Newtonian, Einsteinian, quantum mechanical physics. And there's a problem here, as you may know, because Einstein was never happy with quantum mechanics. If you don't know anything about quantum mechanics, it's an area in physics that deals with very small subatomic particles and in the way in which energy is quantized, broken into definite sized units. And quantum mechanics seems to indicate that some things in the universe are purely due to chance, that it's just a matter of chance whether certain things happen. And Einstein said that can't be right. He said it just can't be right. Einstein said God does not play dice with the universe. God does not play dice with the universe. That's a famous line from Albert Einstein explaining why he didn't like quantum mechanics. So again, quantum mechanics is a part of physics. It seems to suggest that there are things that happen in the universe that are purely due to chance, that have no determinate cause. And Einstein said that's got to be wrong. And he had this famous quip, this famous comment. He said, God does not play dice with the universe. In other words, it doesn't make any sense that we live in a universe where some things happen just because of chance. So these are different kinds of language games, and it's not clear how to reconcile them, how to bring them together. But certainly, if Kuhn's even close to right, these are different language games. There are moves you can make, ways you can use language in one game you can't use in the other. You can also subdivide natural scientific games into biology, physics, chemistry, etc. Prescriptive language games could be divided. And this is not something that Lyotard stresses, but it's worth noticing. So even if we're just talking about prescriptive language games, what kinds are there? There's Western virtue ethics, Aristotelianism. Well, there actually are kinds of Western virtue ethics that are not Aristotelianism, but that's the most influential kind of Western virtue ethics. Chinese virtue ethics, Confucianism. One of the things I'm known for, to some extent, is the interpretation of Confucianism as a form of distinctive virtue ethics, but distinct from Western virtue ethics. There's Western consequentialism, called utilitarianism. There's Chinese consequentialism, which is what many people think the Moda school, Mo in ancient China was. There's rule deontology, which is often the most common form is Kantianism, the ethics of Kant. And these, you could understand these as different language games, games in which different moves are permissible. So, is there one set of facts about prescriptives? Maybe. But if you think about it this way, you might say, well, there are certain things you can say that are permissible moves in Confucianism that are not permissible moves in Aristotelianism. Just like there are things you can do in American football that you can't do in soccer. Now, what implications does this have for metanarratives? In other words, for the stories we tell, or the stories that modernists tell, about why their theories are true or why their theories are justified in a broad sense. Well, the idea is that each game has its own rules. So just like soccer has its own rules, chess has its own rules, soccer and American football have their own rules, Chinese chess and international chess have their own rules. Each language game, the denotative language game, the prescriptive game, the technological game, within the denotative game, each game has its own rules. Within the prescriptive family, each game has its own rules. Thus, no game can disprove another game. So the idea is, I can't say, oh, that American rules football player made a foul. Why? He touched the ball with his hands. He's allowed to touch the ball with his hands. That's allowed in American rules football. Or I can't say, where's the goalie in American rules football? You don't have a goalie in American rules football. You do have one in soccer, though. So you can't use the rules of one game to judge another game. So let me give you an example of how far this can go. When I teach a version of this course in the United States, one article we read is about somebody who takes a similar approach to anthropology. And so this particular anthropologist is talking about, and if you're interested in this, I have the articles in PDF format. Just ask and I'll be happy to give you copies of the relevant articles on this topic. And so this anthropologist is interested in the poison oracle of the African Azandi tribe. And the first anthropologist who studied the Azandi tribe in detail and studied their poison oracle did a very interesting study about the poison oracle. So what's the poison oracle? The poison oracle is done exclusively by men in the community. They go out into the bush, leaving the women behind. They take a bunch of birds with them and a kind of substance called benge. which is made from the roots of a plant. And they administer the benge, the substance made from the plant, to the bird. They shake the bird a little, right? And then they ask the bird a question. And depending on whether the bird lives or dies, and how fast it takes it to live, or how fast it dies, or what it does before it dies, they interpret it and get an answer. Usually the questions they ask are things like, is my wife cheating on me? That's a common one. Is anybody using witchcraft against me? Witchcraft, is anybody using evil magic against me? If so, who is using evil magic against me? And there's a whole, and the first anthropologist who studied this, it was clear, I read his book, he really loves the Azandi people. And he said, I lived among them, I tried to become as much like them as they could, I've done the poison oracle, I've lived in accordance with the poison oracle, I've asked the poison oracle questions, I've organized my life around it, works okay, worked pretty well. But at the end of the book he says, but of course, the poison oracle is unscientific. It's not real. It's just giving poison to a bird. And because the poison is prepared in different doses by accident, and because it's administered in different doses by accident, sometimes the bird dies, sometimes the bird doesn't, sometimes the bird dies after a while, sometimes it gets sick, but then it gets better. And they spend all this time interpreting it. He says, of course, it's not real. Why? It doesn't make any scientific sense. So this first anthropologist said, well, and you can, again, it wasn't like he said, hey, I love the Azandi. But you can tell by the way somebody writes. He respects the Azandi. He cared about them as a people. He's like, he says, I don't believe this myself, but I can live in accordance with it, but it's not real. It's a myth, it's an illusion. Why? It's not scientific. So he writes this. Another anthropologist writes a critique, a criticism. And the other anthropologist says, this first anthropologist has it all wrong. He is interpreting the poison oracle as if it were science. It's not science. It's a different language game. It's a language game for dealing with things like fear that your wife is cheating on you. It's a language game for dealing with the uncertainty in life, like your granary collapses because of termites, and you want some explanation. You want to know why. Why me? Why did my granary collapse because of termites? So the later anthropologist said, you've misunderstood the game. It's not a science language game. So you can't use the rules of the science language game to criticize the poison oracle game because it's not a scientific game. Getting back to Lyotard says, and I think Lyotard would say, yeah, exactly, that's what I think too. So Lyotard thinks that each game has its own rules. No game can disprove another game because they're just different games. And thus, there's no neutral game, no metanarrative that can justify all the other games. There's no higher level game that all the other games are a part of that tells you what the rules should be. So if you ask me, how does the xiang move in Chinese chess, the elephant? I can tell you how it moves. It moves on the diagonal 2 spaces. If you ask, well, yeah, but why? It's like, well, because that's what the rule is. That's how that piece moves. Moves 2 spaces on the diagonal. This way, that way, that way, that way. That's how the piece moves. Yeah, but why? Because that's the rule. Why can't I pick up the ball in soccer unless I'm the goalie? Because that's the rule. Well, the goalie can pick it up. Yeah, he's the goalie. Well, how come he gets to pick it up and I don't? Because that's the rule. The rule is the goalie can pick it up, you can't. That's the rule. But why? There's no why, that's it. He's like, well, I want to know the game that explains all the games, that tells me why the Xiang piece moves the way it does in Chinese chess. Why does the rook move the way it does in Western chess? Why can you pick up the ball in American football but not pick it up in soccer? There's no answer. There's only different games, each with its own rules. So, Lyotard concludes, science plays its own game. It is incapable of legitimating the other language games. The game of prescription, for example, escapes it. But above all, it is incapable of legitimating itself as speculation, philosophical speculation, assumed it could. So if you try to say, well, what legitimates science? What makes it legitimate? Lyotard's going to say, that's like asking why is a certain move legal in soccer or chess? That's just what the rule is. There's no further explanation besides this is the rule. And in particular, you can't use prescription, talking about what ought to be because it's just, or what ought not to be because it's unjust. You can't use that to tell you what science should do. And you can't use science to tell you what is just or what is unjust. Prescription and description are different games. By the way, notice, it's okay if you did not notice this because he says it very quickly. But Russell says that ethical claims are intuitive truths as well. He says ethical claims are descriptive claims, but are intuitively true. Like, for example, pleasure is good is an intuitive descriptive claim. So Russell actually says, well, Russell doesn't use the language game phrase, but Russell says, well, prescription is just a particular kind of description or denotative game. Ethical claims are true and false like any other claim. Lyotard says no. Prescriptive claims are fundamentally different from scientific claims. Each game has its own rules. Now, Lyotard thinks this is going to lead to a political danger. Right? What's the political danger it's going to lead to? The decision makers, the powers in society, allocate our lives for the growth of power. In matters of social justice and of scientific truth alike, the legitimation of that power is based on its optimizing the system's performance efficiency. The application of this criterion to all of our games necessarily entails a certain level of terror, whether soft or hard. Being operational, that is commensurable or disappear. Again, really complicated sentence. Can we break this down? Let's paraphrase. Lyotard's saying, since we play different language games, right? In other words, some of us play the science language game, some play the prescriptive game. Even more than that, we play different prescriptive games. Right? So in the U.S., I don't know how much this is true in China, but in the U.S., it's hard to get people to agree about anything. Right? Some people in the U.S. are very conservative Christians, and they play a Christian language game where, certain things are just wrong. Why? Well, the Bible says this, so you can't do this. The Bible says this, so you have to do it. Other people are also Christians, and they say, well, I don't interpret the Bible that way. So I'm a Christian, but no, that's not what Christianity means to me. Other people are atheists. They say, well, I don't believe in God or religion at all, and I have these values. But then among atheists, you have different values. So people have different views there. They play different language games, different prescriptive games. So you have all these different language games, even when it comes to within prescription. Or, I like the science language game a lot. The science language game is one of my personal favorite games. I love natural science, right? But there are people who play language games where they believe that aliens from other planets visit the Earth and leave signs or symbols to tell us about their visits. There are people in the U.S., I don't know if you get this in China, I bet not, because this is a more sensible country. But in the U.S., there are people who they get to appear on TV who will say things like, I was taken by an alien spaceship. A spaceship from another planet took me up into it. I met the aliens, they flew me around the Earth, and I came back. And they'll get interviewed on TV. Like, really? How interesting. Really? Then what did the aliens do, and what did they say, and what did they look like? And people will take them kind of seriously. So that's a kind of denotative game, because it's about claims of true and false. But the standard in that language game is a standard I would never accept. I'd say, well, that's crazy. That's a crazy language. But the person who plays that game, like my sister does not claim she was abducted by aliens, but if you told her that you were taken away by aliens, she would believe you. I love my sister, but that's a fact. I mean, if you told her, yeah, oh, aliens, she'd be, oh, really? You know. So some people play that game. So you can't get anybody in the U.S. to agree about anything. What's the one thing we can all agree about? More is better than less. Why? It's more. Is it good to have one brand of shampoo? Yeah. Wouldn't it be better to have two? Sure. How about 4? Yeah. I think you can see this already in China, right? You can certainly see it. When I go to the store, the Chaoshi, the supermarket in China, I see it already. But in the U.S., if anything, it's at least as bad, maybe worse. What do I mean? There are so many kinds of shampoo, to wash your hair. I don't know what to buy. I get confused. There's so many of them. I just ask friends, I say, tell me what to buy. I don't know. There's too many of them. Right? But we think, oh, that's better. Thank goodness we have so many brands of shampoo. Because more is better than less. Is it good to have a car? Oh, it's nice to have a car. Wouldn't you like a new car every 5 years? Oh, yeah. What about a new car every 3 years? Because a new car every 3 years is more cars than one every 5 years. Yeah, it's got to be better. It's more. So the one value that everybody agrees with when you disagree about everything else is more is better. And so if people give you more, you say, you're doing a good job. I may not like your religion. I may not like your other values. I may not agree with you about anything else. But if you give me more, I'll say, well, that was good. Give me more. More is better than less. Now, since Lyotard is suggesting, he said, well, if that's the only thing we agree about is that more is better than less, if that's the only justification for power, for government authority, for government power, then government is going to have to, in the name of efficiency, silence any games that get in the way of efficiency. So if the reason people hold governmental power, Lyotard says, if people in the West hold government power because they are able to be more efficient in producing things, then if there's a language game that gets in the way of that slows down efficiency, that language game must be stopped. Why? It's in the way of efficiency. And Lyotard says, those in power enforce efficiency with terror. And I put it in quotation marks because it's kind of a technical term. A 专有名词 for Lyotard, kind of technical term for him. So the idea is we have all these different language games, we just can't agree on the prescriptions. Sometimes we don't even agree on the descriptions, the denotative claims. But we can still agree that more is better than less, efficiency. And so then, if you ask government, what are you there for? What's the government supposed to do? The idea is the government will say, we'll make sure you have more. But if that's the only thing the government does, it says, well, you should vote for us because you'll have more if you vote for us. Then the government will say, we have to silence anything that prevents us from being efficient, because that's the only justification they have for power. So then Lyotard claims, and he thinks this is a problem in the West, that those in power enforce efficiency with terror. So what is terror? Lyotard says, by terror, I mean the efficiency gained by eliminating or threatening to eliminate a player from the language game one shares with him. He is silenced or consents, not because he has been refuted, but because his ability to participate has been threatened. There are many ways to prevent someone from playing. The decision maker's arrogance, which in principle has no equivalent in the sciences, consists in the exercise of terror. It says, adapt your aspirations to our ends or else. So, by terror, what Lyotard means is removing somebody from a language game or eliminating a language game by either threatening somebody or simply removing them somehow from the game. Lyotard says this is what those in power will do in order to maximize efficiency. So, if you do not adapt your aspirations, your goals, to our ends, our goals, and what are our goals? Greater efficiency. Then we will eliminate you or threaten to eliminate you from the game. And there's an old saying in Western chess. Sometimes the threat is more powerful than the actual execution. In other words, sometimes just threatening to do something in a game of chess is actually a more powerful move than doing it. So what would examples of terror be? Well, if someone says things that you disagree with, or raises questions that you find it uncomfortable to answer, it is terror, according to Lyotard, if you ban the distribution of her books, articles, or web posts, fire her or threaten to fire her, imprison her or threaten to imprison her. Now, what alternative is there to terror, though? Because after all, we have all these different language games. Is there any alternative to exercising terror? And Lyotard discusses two options. One option is given by a very famous, I believe he's still alive, European philosopher, German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen Habermas is a very interesting philosopher. If I still had the analytic continental split on the board, Jürgen Habermas would be on the continental side, but in many ways he's similar to many analytic philosophers. He writes in style that's kind of analytic, and I think he's fascinating, and I'm actually more, my own views are closer to those of Jürgen Habermas than they are to Lyotard's. But that's just my opinion, I could be wrong. But so Lyotard's discussing, well, what are the alternatives to terror then? And he says, well, is legitimacy to be found in consensus, agreement, obtained through discussion, as Jürgen Habermas thinks? And that, in a nutshell, means in a really short phrase, is Jürgen Habermas' philosophy. He says what we're aiming at is agreement through discussion. What kind of discussion? Discussion without terror. Now we'll look in a minute about in more details of what Habermas means by discussion. But for Habermas, the goal is discussion, eventually achieving consensus. But Lyotard doesn't like that idea. He says such consensus, the kind of consensus that Jürgen Habermas wants to achieve, does violence to the heterogeneity of language games. And invention is always born of dissension. That's a really cute sentence because there's a rhyme in it. And invention is always born of dissension. That's actually a nice sentence. That's actually a good one. It's a little too kind of cute, but it is kind of a nicely done sentence. So that was what does he mean? He means when you come up with new things, it comes up because somebody disagreed with something somebody else said. Postmodern knowledge, this is what Lyotard advocates, is not simply a tool of the authorities. It, postmodern knowledge, refines our sensitivity to differences and reinforces our ability to tolerate being incommensurable. its principle is not the expert's homology, but the inventor's paralogy. Now, so you notice, he's got a really cute sentence. I just had it a second ago. Where is it? Invention is always part of ascension. Cute sentence, clear internal rhyme. Here, its principle is not the expert's homology, but the inventor's paralogy. I know what he means by that, and it's got an internal rhyme, but that's much less clear. So that sentence, personally, I don't like as much as a sentence, because it's hard to understand what he means. And he hasn't explained to us yet what paralogy is. So I don't like that sentence so much. Although it's cute. When you know what he means, it's really clever. Now, what does this mean? Well, first, let's figure out what Habermas is talking about. And Habermas is part of the Hermeneutic tradition, which is the third major tradition we're going to talk about in the course. We looked at Russell as our example of a modernist. Kuhn was our transition figure to postmodernism. Lyotard is full-on postmodernist. Habermas is kind of a hermeneutic figure. And this is what the hermeneutic tradition is about, really basically. First, it's wrong to silence anyone through fear. So a basic commitment of Habermas's view of the hermeneutic tradition is you can't make someone stop arguing with you by threatening them or by forcibly eliminating them from the game. So the hermeneutic tradition is committed to the idea that somebody can argue with you, you can argue with them. What you can't do is silence them through fear. Secondly, dialogue must show awareness of and respect for different values and perceptions. So, when you're engaging in dialogue, part of what you have to do is be aware of it. And not just aware of it, but respect differences in values and different perceptions of the world. So, for example, this is an issue that's especially big in the U.S. because of, and it may also be an issue in China. I'm not saying it isn't, I don't know. But I know in the U.S. there's a big issue that different groups, different genders, male and female, and different ethnic groups, black Americans, white Americans, often perceive the world in different ways. Right? So for example, it's often in the U.S. I don't think this is an issue because of crime rates, low crime rates here. I don't think this is an issue, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Women in the U.S. are often very sensitive to danger at night. And so they're often at night, they're kind of like looking around, always observing very carefully. And so as a man, when I'm walking around, if there's a woman at night, I don't know, I try to be careful and not do anything that she might mistakenly think is a threat. Right? So if a woman's walking, I don't walk right behind her. Right? And you can tell me if I'm wrong, but on this campus, I don't worry about that so much. If that's a mistake, tell me, I'll stop doing it. But on this campus, people don't seem as nervous, so if I'm walking at night, there's a female student, I'll walk whatever. But in the U.S., I would go out of my way to cross the street, to walk around her so she could see me. So like, well, the guy walking around me, he's not a threat. Right? Just to be clear, not dangerous. I think, you could tell me if I'm wrong, that not as much of an issue here. Also, and as you may know, there are riots off and on in St. Louis right now because a black teenager was shot by a police officer. There are very different perceptions among black Americans and white Americans over police actions. And white Americans, for the most part, tend to think, oh, we love the police. They protect us. They're our friends. You know? Whereas many African Americans will say, well, even conservative ones will sometimes say, well, I have been stopped by white police for doing nothing. Even Obama has said, when I was younger, I sometimes got stopped and I wasn't doing anything. It was just, well, you're black. We're just going to stop you because you're black. You're probably doing something. Right? And the Attorney General of the U.S., he just recently resigned to do other work. Eric Holder is also an African American. And he said, yeah, same thing. He said, at least, Obama and Eric Holder, they've been just law-abiding, ethical people their entire life. And Eric Holder said, yeah, when I was a kid, I got stopped by the police, and as far as I could tell, it was because I was black. The police never stopped me. I'm a white guy. The only time I'm ever stopped by the police is when I'm speeding in my car, and half the time, they don't give me a ticket. I just smile and I'm nice to them, and they're like, all right, well, watch it, okay, buddy? I'm like, okay, officer. You know, like, and then they go ahead. And like, that's all that happens. That does not happen if you're a black person. It doesn't. And I have some very good friends who are police officers. So I'm not opposed to police officers. But it's important to recognize you have a dialogue. You can't say, oh, well, come on, you know, the police are great. What do you know about the police about? Well, if you're African American, maybe you don't. All right, take a quick break and we'll keep talking in a few minutes. Let's show you something. So we'll continue with Habermas. So first principle of the hermeneutic tradition is wrong to silence anyone through fear. Second, dialogue must show awareness of and respect for different values and perceptions. Again, remember Kuhn, I had to read part of the preface to the Essential Tension. I'll just mention it one more time. When he says, when he reads Aristotle and he just thinks, boy, Aristotle seems stupid, he's like, I've got to figure out what are the values and perceptions that lead Aristotle and the later Aristotelians to think what they're saying makes sense. And Kuhn says, this is what I try to teach my students, is how to do things. And in that preface, Kuhn describes himself as hermeneutic. He said, I didn't know the word before recently, Kuhn says, but I am hermeneutic. Third, dialogue begins from a background of shared assumptions. And the idea is, there's a reason this is really important. In the think about Descartes. If you've read Descartes, if you haven't, I'll explain what I mean. So modernism, in a way, begins in the Enlightenment with people like Descartes, and it continues to people like Russell, and it's still going with many philosophers in the analytic tradition. What Descartes tried to do was to find a way of doing philosophy in which you could doubt everything. And you could arrive at beliefs starting from complete doubts. Russell, in The Problems of Philosophy, in a part I did not have you read, says that Descartes made a great contribution to philosophy by showing us that philosophy should begin from your own personal ideas, which you may or may not be able to prove actually refer to the world. But Russell said Descartes had really set a good background for philosophy. So Descartes and Russell are trying to find things that cannot be doubted. So Descartes doubts to try to find things that you could not doubt. Russell tries to find things you could not doubt. Hermeneutic people like Habermas says, well, you could doubt anything, but let's only talk about the things, let's start from the things that we agree with. Let's start from the things that we agree about. So let's not doubt everything. Let's only doubt things that one of us actually has a reason to doubt. So dialogue begins from a background of shared assumptions. What are some things that you believe and I believe that we have in common? And you can question any assumption. There's no assumption that we're going to say, that's intuitive. You're not allowed to question that. Or that's self-evident. You're not allowed to question that. But your doubts must be sincere. So you don't doubt just to doubt. You don't doubt just for the sake of doubting. You say, I doubt this, if you really doubt it. So many philosophers, there's actually a famous philosopher at Harvard who passed away just a few years ago named Hilary Putnam. And he's done some interesting work. I'm not going to deny that. But he's very famous for his brain in a vat argument. So what's Putnam's brain in a vat argument? It's very like a kind of science fiction kind of example. So Putnam says, suppose there's a vat with some kind of special chemicals in it, and there's a brain in that vat, and nothing else but the brain. And some scientists have put some electrodes into the brain, and they're stimulating the parts of the brain to make it think it's got a body, and to make it think it lives in a world that doesn't exist. So suppose there's a brain in a vat of fluid, some kind of liquid that keeps it alive, and scientists have put these probes or electrodes into the brain, and they're sending electricity into the brain, making the brain think it's got a body, and making the brain think it lives in a world that does not exist. And Putnam says, how do you know you're not a brain in a vat? How do you know you're not a disembodied brain sitting in a vat somewhere with scientists fooling you into thinking that you live in this world? So maybe I'm that. I'm a brain in a vat. And you guys don't exist. I just think you exist because the scientists are sending signals into my brain, making me see things that aren't there, and making me hear things that aren't there. And they're just doing this as an experiment. And Putnam says, how would you know whether you were a brain in a vat? There's a whole literature. There are books and articles all about brains and vats. Philosophers in the hermeneutic tradition, like Habermas or like me, say, why exactly are you worried about this? So Hilary, if I may call you Hilary, I actually met Hilary Putnam a couple times. I guess I can call him Hilary. Hilary, if I may say so, if I may call you that, Hilary, do you actually believe that you're a brain in a vat? And I'm sure Putnam would say, well, no, of course not. That would be crazy. Okay, so we agree you're not really a brain in a vat. And I'm not bringing it back, right? Yes. Okay. So let's not talk about that anymore. We both agree we're not brains and bats. You don't really doubt that you're not a brain in a vat. That's not a real doubt you have. So there's no point arguing about it. So for the hermeneutic tradition, you say you start from what you already agree about, and you can question anything, but you only question things you actually have a genuine doubt about. Not just things that are imaginary, because anything could be questionable. The issue is what do you actually question. And then the objective of the dialogue is mutual understanding and uncoerced agreement. So what's the point of the dialogue? The dialogue is going to begin from a background of shared assumptions. It's going to have to show an awareness of and respect for different values and perceptions. You can question anything you want as long as it's a sincere question. And the goal of it is to understand the person you're having a dialogue with better and to reach an agreement that is uncoerced, that is to say, not forced, not achieved by terror. So that's the basic hermeneutic tradition. And so whereas Russell is trying to find these intuitive foundations of knowledge that you can't doubt, the hermeneutic tradition says, no, you could doubt anything. But the question is, what do you actually doubt? And we don't doubt most things. You don't doubt that you're in a classroom right now during a lecture. You don't doubt that I'm from the United States. You don't doubt that I'm speaking English. You don't even doubt that I've got a French bulldog as a pet, even though you've never met it. Because you think, well, why would you lie about having a French bulldog as a pet? So we agree about all those things. There's no point trying to prove them because we already agree about them. If you actually had a doubt, though, then you could raise it as a doubt. So Lyotard has the postmodern approach. What's the postmodern approach? It's wrong to silence anyone through fear. Same thing as the first step on the hermeneutic approach. Second one, dialogue must show awareness of and respect for different values and perceptions. Same as the second one on the hermeneutic approach. So far, it's looking like these are pretty much the same. But the key difference is, for Lyotard, the objective of dialogue is to invent new language games through paralogy. So the objective for Lyotard is not to reach consensus. The objective is to invent new language games. How do you do it? Through paralogy. Paralogy is an English word. It's a pre-existing English word. It's a really rare, unusual word. It's used by Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. And I think Lyotard's use of the term paralogy is influenced by Kant's use. So I did some research, and I think it's pretty clear Lyotard gets the word and the use of it from Kant, although he does not use it exactly the same way Kant does. So what is paralogy? In technical sense, paralogy in classic logic is the name of a logical fallacy, an error in reasoning, in classical logic. A paralogism is a fallacious argument, a mistaken argument, which is mistaken because a term, a word, in the argument is used ambiguously. So in classical logic, a paralogism is a bad thing. What kind of thing? It's a mistaken type of argument. It's a category of mistaken argument. What kind of category? A category where the argument is mistaken because a key term is used ambiguously. Here's an example. Premise 1, pigs have 4 legs. Premise 2, my roommate is a pig. Conclusion, my roommate has 4 legs. Now, I went back and forth on this because I wasn't sure. Do you say something in Chinese, like suppose your roommate is really messy. They never clean stuff up. They're always making a mess. They make dirty dishes. They never wash the dishes. They leave food out. They never clean up. They never clean the floor. They never clean the bathroom. Whatever you have that needs to be cleaned, they never clean that. Is that a metaphor you have in Chinese? You call them a pig ever? You do, okay. All right, good. Is there like a special way you just say like Tasha Jew, or you say like that, or okay, yeah. So that okay, good. So you can see what's going on here. So pigs have 4 legs. That's true. That premise is true. My roommate is a pig. That could very well be true. I don't know your roommate. That could very well be true too. Your roommate is a pig. Maybe there's no plausible account on which your roommate is not a pig. Right? Now, pigs have 4 legs. All A's are B. My roommate is a pig. C is an A. Therefore, conclusion, my roommate has 4 legs. Looks like it should be a valid argument. Of course it's not. Why not? Pigs, or pig, is used ambiguously. Here you mean the animal. Here you mean a messy person. There's a technical name for this mistake. It's called a paralogy. Kant refers to, there's a section of Kant's most famous work, Immanuel Kant's most famous work, is the Critique of Pure Reason. And there's a section called the Paralogisms. And it's about arguments that Kant thinks are mistaken because they have this feature. There's a key term used ambiguously. But again, in classical logic, it's the name of a mistake. That's not the way Lyotard is using it. For Lyotard, paralogy is the development of new language games through intentional violations of the rules of the old game. Right? So in classical logic, you say, well, paralogy, that's a bad thing. You don't want paralogies. Why? Well, because you're using terms in ways that are confusing and ambiguous. But Lyotard says, no, that's a good term. Let's adopt that term. Because what we want to do is invent new language games and new ways of reasoning. But the new language games will use words in new ways. And they will have ways of arguing that don't make sense in terms of earlier forms of argument. So that's why he adopts this term. He adopts a term that refers to a fallacious, a mistaken kind of argument, and says, actually, that's a good term. Because it refers to an argument that is mistaken because it uses a term incorrectly. So Lyotard says, I'm going to use it to refer to inventing new language games by using terms in new ways and arguing in new ways that seem like mistakes in terms of earlier logic. So what is Lyotard's critique of Habermas? We saw what his view is. It has some similarities to Habermas, but also the main goal for Lyotard of dialogue is paralogy, creating new language groups. Lyotard says, and this is going back to that long quotation we had up where Lyotard talked about what he didn't like about, go back to it really quickly. Yeah, so, but his legitimacy to be found in consensus obtains through discussion, as Jason Habermas thinks. Such consensus does violence of the heterogeneity of language games, inventions only more dissension. Postmodern knowledge is not simply a tool of the authorities, it refines our sensitivity to differences and reinforces our ability to tolerate the incommensurable. Its principle is not the expert's homology, but the inventor's paralogy. Now we know what paralogy is. Homology, homos, means same. And so homology would be using words and using logic in the same way. Paralogy, using words and using logic in new ways. So Lyotard's critique, his criticism of Habermas is consensus, which is the goal of Habermas's dialogue, does violence to the heterogeneity of language games. So it's not literal violence. What he means is, look, if you try to achieve consensus, that doesn't recognize the fact that there are always going to be a bunch of different language games. You shouldn't expect to ever achieve consensus. What you should expect is that there's always going to be a bunch of language games. Just accept that. So the goal of consensus is a bad goal because it doesn't respect the different kinds of language games that exist. So the first criticism that Lyotard raises against Habermas is he says, consensus is not a good goal to have. Secondly, Lyotard says, invention is always born of dissension. So Lyotard's saying, well, look, we want to be creative, we want to come up with new things, but how does that happen? It happens through dissent. It happens when somebody disagrees, when they don't have a consensus. When they say, well, I choose not to agree with what you're saying. I have a different way of doing things, a different understanding of those terms, a different language. In contrast, Lyotard says, postmodernism refines our sensitivity to differences. And so Lyotard says, once we give up the hope of a metanarrative that would justify everything, we are going to be more sensitive to differences. We'll be on the lookout for how people think differently about things. We won't expect people to feel the same way. So let me admit this. When I went to college, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but this is true. Right? When I went to college, I come from a very small town in western Pennsylvania. Right? And it was like a really small town. And it's a small town. The social changes that affected America in the 60s and 70s did not touch my small town. They're like a wave that just kind of went over my town without touching it. Right? So my town was like this kind of bubble of like old-fashioned thinking. So it's amazing, trust me, that I'm here now. It's just amazing, because it's just that you don't produce people in my hometown who end up in China lecturing in Wuhan. So pat me on the back, because that's weird. So I come from a town that's very small, very old-fashioned. Everybody in it is white. Almost everybody is Christian. That's what our town's like. Most people are pretty conservative politically. And so when I went away to college, I went to University of Pennsylvania. And as I was meeting other students, I met one student, and he mentioned that he was Muslim. And I said, oh. I thought you said you were from the U.S. He said, yeah, I'm from the U.S. And I said, you're a Muslim and you're from the U.S.? And he's like, yeah. And, I'm looking back, I'm like, well, that's the rudest, stupidest thing I could have possibly said, because I'm kind of saying, well, how could you be an American if you're a Muslim? That's a dumb question. There are plenty of American Muslims. There are American Buddhists, there are American Hindus, there are American, of course, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Mormons, atheists. There are all kinds of things, right? But I come from this small town, so I'm like, I never met an American who was a Muslim before. And if you'd asked me, are there Americans who are Muslims, I would have said, yeah, but they probably look really different. I bet I would look at one and I would know. And this guy looked like, he didn't look Chinese, he was a white guy, but he looked like any regular white guy. And so I'm like, hey, just like a white guy like me. He's like, how could he be a Muslim? Like, again, really stupid, really dumb, ignorant view on my part. But, so Lyotard says, well, look, once you realize there's a variety of different language games, you're going to be more sensitive to differences. You won't assume that everybody has the same religion you have. You won't assume that everybody has the same values you have. You won't assume that everybody has the same political views you do. So, interesting fact, I probably should take this as a compliment, but when I meet people in the U.S., they usually assume I belong to whatever political party they belong to. And I think it's because they kind of assume, like, well, you seem nice, you must be a Republican. Or you seem nice, you must be a Democrat. Bless you. And so, but again, that's like, oh, well, everybody who's nice thinks the way I do. But Lyotard says, well, postmodernism, you recognize there's just a bunch of different language games. You're more sensitive to that. And postmodernism, Lyotard claims, reinforces our ability to tolerate the incommensurable. So when we meet a case where we just can't reach agreement on this point, Lyotard says, if you have a postmodern perspective, you're better able to tolerate cases where you can't reach agreement because you play a different game. Now, one of the things that I think is nice about the structure of this course is usually people are either modernists or postmodernists or they're hermeneutic thinkers when you get right down to it. Usually you're one of those three. It usually can fit into one of those boxes in a broad sense. And many, at least in the U.S., many people are postmodernists at heart And this seems immensely plausible to them. They just think this seems exactly right. They say, no, consensus cannot be the goal of dialogue because it fails to do justice to the fact that we're not all playing the same language game. And invention comes about through people playing different language games and inventing new language games. Galileo invented a new language game. That's how he came up with a new kind of astronomy. And seeing the variety of language games makes us more sensitive to difference and reinforces our ability to tolerate cases where there's really no way to reach agreement because we have incommensurable views. Remember, incommensurable, this is a term that Lyotard is consciously borrowing from Thomas Kuhn. And we had a whole lecture on incommensurability. Now, if we step back for a second and say, okay, what are Lyotard's fundamental values? What are the values that motivate Lyotard? Well, clearly one of them is toleration for incommensurable language games. Why? Well, he says this is an advantage of postmodernism. It helps you tolerate different language games. A second value is appreciation of incommensurable language games. And toleration and appreciation are kind of different. Toleration is like when, suppose, this happens a lot in the US, maybe it happens in China too. Sometimes you get a roommate and their taste in music is really different from yours. And they're always playing music in the room, and you might tolerate their music, where you're like, oh, man, that is awful, but I'm going to be nice, I'm going to tolerate it. Right? But you might also listen to it and say, actually, that's kind of good. I never heard this stuff before. It's not my favorite thing, but I kind of appreciate that music now. Right? So toleration is where you're like, I don't really like this, but I'm going to tolerate it. That's a different language game. Appreciation is when you're like, I kind of see what's nice about it. Even if it's not my thing, my favorite thing, I see what's good about it. So I try to do that a lot, to appreciate different things. So I have friends who are really into, I don't know if you know this English idiom. You probably do, just in case. It comes up a lot. It's slang. Really into jazz. What does that mean? It means he likes jazz a lot. He knows a lot about jazz music. Right? So he's really into jazz. So I have friends who are really into music, and they have very strong opinions about it. They always make fun of my taste in music, because they say I have horrible taste in music. Right? But I like to think I just appreciate lots of different kinds of music. And so I'll listen to music and now I'm going to forget her name, Taylor Swift. Right? Yeah. So I'll listen to Taylor Swift and I'll be like, that's a catchy song. I kind of like it. Right? And my friends who are really into music say, how can you like Taylor Smith? She's terrible. I was like, I don't know, it's kind of nice, it's kind of cute. 22, feeling 22, and so that's appreciation. Toleration is like, whatever, I mean, it's not my job to prevent the world from listening to Taylor Swift, but it is one. But appreciation is, so Lyotard's saying, at the least, toleration, but even better, appreciation. And finally, creativity. Right? That's a really central value for Lyotard, because he's saying that's the whole point of dialogue, is to do new creative things with language, come up with new language games, invent new things. And so that's the ultimate goal, not consensus and not truth. Because after all, truth is just the goal of a certain kind of language game. Now, here's a problem that some of you have already raised. What about Lyotard and Plato's argument? Right, now, what's Plato's argument? Remember, in the dialogue of Theaetetus, it's a hard dialogue, but there's a lot of interesting stuff. The Theaetetus is the dialogue where Plato says that knowledge is justified true belief, and that becomes the standard definition of knowledge for 2,400 years in Western philosophy. But also the Theaetetus, Plato talks about relativism. Plato gives an argument against relativism, the view that truth depends on your perspective. And ever since then, philosophers have thought, boy, that's an awfully good argument against relativism. And we saw how you might apply Plato's argument to Kuhn. But you also might apply Plato's argument to Lyotard. How so? Isn't Lyotard's own view about incommensurable language games just another meta-narrative, a theory about theories? And shouldn't we be incredulous toward Lyotard's meta-narrative? So Lyotard's telling us, look, you shouldn't believe any meta-narrative about narratives. They're all suspect. But that's a meta-narrative. Now, admittedly, there's a distinction you could draw here in defense of Lyotard. You could say, well, but Lyotard's not giving you a meta-narrative that justifies a narrative, and that's a difference. But Lyotard is giving you a narrative which he thinks is not just a language game. He thinks, well, no, Lyotard, am not just playing one language game. I'm playing the language game that tells you the other language games are not justified. But then your language game is special, isn't it? How come your language game gets to be special? This is if you can learn to do this, I've been at conferences where I've seen professional philosophers just get destroyed because somebody says, what if we applied your theory to your theory? They'll just fall into this trap again and again. So if you can just learn to do this, just always ask, what if you apply the theory to itself? A lot of times you get a mess. So I'm not saying that's a complete refutation, but that's a good question. Hasn't Lyotard just given us another language game, but a language game that claims to be authoritative, to have a special status that the other language games don't have? And how can Lyotard consistently reject Habermas's language game? If Lyotard was going to say, look, there's just a bunch of different language games, you shouldn't say some are better than others, each has its own rules. The rules of Lyotard's language game are aim for consensus. How can you say, don't play that game? That's the rules of Habermas's language game. Aim for consensus. Lyotard says, oh no, that's not right because of the heterogeneity of language games. Right? But Habermas's language game, that's part of the rules of his game. Unless you say some rules of language games or some language games are just wrong, how can you reject Habermas's language game? But if you reject Habermas's language game, well, then not all language games are the same, are they? Some language games are better than others. And some of you raised this question, what about a language game whose rules included use terror to eliminate other language games? Suppose that's your language game. Imagine the language game of Nazism. Part of the language game of Nazism is, and Nazism has its own language game, is only one master race. Everybody else has to be exterminated. All other language games must be eliminated. That's one of the reasons why the Nazis burned books. Because they were like, there can be no other language games. There can be only one. So the Nazis burned books. Why? So nobody would have a record of it. Oh, by the way, in the next section we're going to be reading in 2 weeks from today, Lyotard's going to talk about the foundation of the University of Berlin, which was very influential historically. The Wuhan University is modeled on European and American universities. European and American universities are modeled on the University of Berlin, which was just like the place that just set the standard for modern universities all over the world. And if you go, that university still exists, And if you go there, they have a jiantang, I don't remember the word in Chinese, I think it's memorial, a memorial hall. I guess I'm making progress in learning Chinese, I couldn't remember the English for a second. They have a memorial hall there for books that were burned by the Nazis. And it's just an empty room with shelves on it that have no books on it. And it's just a plaque on it says, you know, it's some quotation from a Nazi leader saying, you know, we will burn all the books of other thinkers. And it's just a reminder that libraries are what preserves truth, and destroying books or making books unavailable is the opposition to truth. So, but suppose we had a game like Nazism that said, okay, this is our language game. Eliminate other language games through terror. Now, of course, Lyotard is going to say, well, no, you're not allowed to play that game. But why, if the only thing you can say about a game is, these are the rules of the game? Right? The whole structure of Lyotard's argument is, there are different language games, each game has its own rules, you can't use the rules of American football to criticize the way someone plays Chinese chess. They're different games. But then, why can we use the rules of Lyotard's language game to criticize Nazism? I would, but how, given Lyotard's principles? Now, Lyotard says, so all the major themes are there in the introduction. In the next section, what Lyotard's doing is he's going to talk about the major narratives of legitimation of knowledge, and he says there's two: emancipation and speculation. Now again, this is an example where if I were teaching Lyotard writing, I would fix this. I'd say, well, look, you said narratives here, you mean metanarratives. Right? And that's central to his picture is you got narratives and you got metanarratives. I wish he would be consistent. But the chapter title is Narratives of Legitimation of Knowledge. He means metanarratives. In other words, stories about why knowledge is justified. And he says, in the modern era, there have been two of them: emancipation and speculation. The subject of the first of these versions of a meta-narrative is humanity as the hero of liberty. The second one, speculation, one may be tempted to reduce this entire approach to the one may be tempted to reduce this entire approach to the politics of the scientific institution to the famous dictum, science for its own sake. And notice, these are square brackets. If you insert a word or you change one word to make a quotation more clear, you use square brackets, not parentheses. That's a way of warning the reader, this word is not in the original. So that's like a format. So first let's look a little bit at the meta-narrative of emancipation. According to the meta-narrative of emancipation, so these are meta-narratives that are used to justify either claims to knowledge or prescriptions, statements about what is just and unjust. And in the meta-narrative of emancipation, the idea is that in pre-modern society, knowledge was denied to the people by priests and tyrants. Due to a lack of knowledge, people could not effectively exercise freedom to make intelligent choices. And the people's ignorance leads both to dangerous superstitions, but also provides an excuse for those in power to exercise authority over the people. So according to the meta-narrative of emancipation, the reason knowledge is so important is people need knowledge to make good decisions. Without knowledge, they'll have superstitions, which will be very dangerous. But also, the people's ignorance will give those in government positions an excuse to exercise authority over the people. They'll say, well, the people don't know what's good for them. Well, if they don't have knowledge, of course they don't. However, Lyotard wants to say there's limits in principle to what emancipation as a narrative can do. He says, the only role positive knowledge can play is to inform the practical subject about the reality within which the execution of the prescription is to be inscribed. It allows the subject to circumscribe the executable, or what is possible to do. But the executory, what should be done, is not within the purview of positive knowledge. It is one thing for an undertaking to be possible and another for it to be just. Running a little short on time, so I'm not going to try to unpack that sentence by sentence. You can do it, but I'll just paraphrase it. According to the narrative of emancipation, knowledge is important because it informs the free citizen of what is possible, and therefore allows the citizen to use his or her own reason in government. However, knowing what we can do does not tell us what we should do. So, the metanarrative of emancipation says we have to give knowledge to the people because they will be superstitious if you don't give them knowledge. And besides, they can make their own decisions if you would just give them knowledge. But Lyotard says there's something to that, but the thing is, even if you gave people knowledge, it would tell them what they could do. It wouldn't tell them what they should do. And given how many language games there are, it's not clear they will reach agreement. So this raises the question of how it is possible in a postmodern context to distinguish between justice and injustice. Now, one of the seminal works in the meta-narrative of emancipation is Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? We didn't have time to go over this in detail in the course, but this is available on the QQ for the course. I gave you a Chinese translation of it, also an English translation of it. It's a famous essay from the Enlightenment era. It came out originally in 1787, very influential. And in it, Kant says, have the courage to use your own reason. That is the motto of Enlightenment. If I have a book which understands for me, a pastor, a priest or a minister, who has a conscience for me, a physician, a doctor, who decides my diet, and so forth, I need not trouble myself. I need not think if I can only pay. Others will readily undertake the irksome work of thinking for me. Now, what does that mean? What he's saying is, have the courage to use your own reason. That's the model of the Enlightenment, and that's what Kant is saying you should do. But he says, what happens is people say, well, I don't have to think. I've got a book which tells me what the truth is. I don't have to decide what's right and wrong. My priest or my minister or my rabbi or my imam will tell me what to do. I don't have to decide what course of exercise or diet. I'll just ask my doctor. And Kant says, if you want to be lazy, you don't have to think for yourself. There's always going to be somebody who will think for you if you let them do it. Kant continues, for this enlightenment, for genuine enlightenment, however, nothing is required but freedom, and indeed the most harmless among all the things to which this term can properly be applied. It is freedom to make public use of one's reason at every point. But I hear on all sides, do not argue. The officer says, he means the officer in the military, do not argue but drill. The tax collector, do not argue but pay. The cleric, the priest or the minister, do not argue but believe. So, again, it's a subtly written piece because he's going back and forth expressing his own view and then kind of mocking the other view. And so he says, look, all that's necessary to achieve enlightenment is a certain kind of freedom. But, he says, at every point I hear people saying, don't argue. So the officers in the military say, don't argue, drill. The tax collector says, don't argue, but just pay your taxes. The priest, the minister says, don't argue, just believe in your religion. Everywhere there's restriction on freedom, which restriction is an obstacle to enlightenment and which is not an obstacle but a promoter of it? I answer, the public use of one's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among men. Kant claims that the right to argue however you wish about whatever you wish in public forums must be free and unconstrained. That's what he means by the public use of one's reason. He says that's what promotes enlightenment. People get smarter, they learn more, they think more if they're able to argue, express their opinions, hear other people's opinions in public forums. And he says that should never be restrained. However, in contrast, Kant argues that the private use of reason must be restricted. By the private use of reason, Kant means what one says and argues in one's official responsibility, soldier, police officer, priest, etc. So, for example, I served a term as chair of the philosophy department in my college. Sometimes, what a chair does, at least in my college, is students bring questions to you. You take the questions to the rest of the department. The rest of the department gives you an answer. You take the answer back to the student, and the student yells at you about not liking the answer. So my job as chair is to say, this is the department policy. I might think it's a dumb policy, but my job as chair is, that is the policy. That's my private use of reason. Why? It's my job as chair. My job as chair is not to say, well, I kind of agree with you. I think it's a pretty stupid rule. My job as chair is to say, I'm sorry you're unhappy. That is the rule, and the department has decided not to make an exception in your case. If you're unhappy, you may go to the dean of faculty, who will back us up. And then you can go to the president of the college, who will also back us up. I didn't ask those who will back us up, because that would be a jerk. In summary, Kant argues citizens have a right to use their reason in public forums to discuss whatever issues they choose to. However, this is possible only if and only because citizens obey the laws and perform their duties. Kant's slogan is, argue as much as you will and about what you will, only obey. Right, so argue as much as you will and about what you will, only obey. Just give me one more minute. So Kant's basic idea is what's not, I think in the U.S., I have told my students in the U.S., what I say is, look, so for example, I mentioned earlier that many black people in the United States feel like police treat them unfairly. Many states have adopted a policy that says you cannot stop somebody just because of their race. It's called no racial profiling. Many police officers say that's a dumb policy because many people who we know are criminals happen to be black. So why can't I stop the person who's black? And Kant would say, you know what? You're entitled to argue that you should be allowed to stop people based on their race. You can write an editorial in the paper saying that. You can publish on the internet saying that. You can argue on television saying that. When you go to work as a police officer, do not do that. Why? Because when you're a police officer, it's time to do your job. That's your private use of reason. And you will do it in your job. But in the public forum, you can say whatever you want. So Kant's basic slogan, argue as much as you will and about what you will in public forums, but that's only possible, that will only work if you obey the laws and if you like, you do what your job is. As chair, I don't get to say, well, I'll let you not obey this rule because I think it's pretty stupid. No. I say, you will obey the rule, that's the decision of the department, even though in my head I'm thinking, back in the meeting I was saying, you gotta be kidding me, that's the dumbest rule I ever heard. And like, what's the vote? Oh, 6-3, Bryan loses. I go back and I say, that's the rule. Exception. So, that's Kant, and next time we'll look at metanarratives of speculation 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks from today. A lot farther in this lecture. I thought it was actually a lot farther in, that's why I was going kind of slow. I thought it was actually like almost done. Didn't realize how much farther I go. But that's okay, we have plenty of good material to go through. So, yeah, I put this up at the beginning of class. This is just what was up at the beginning of class, if you didn't see the beginning of class. So next week, no class, no office hours. 2 weeks from now, office hours as usual, class as usual. No writing assignment due for next week, no writing assignment due for the week after that.